What if a children's movie from 1994 contained a blueprint for the chaos we're witnessing in 2024? What if Disney animators, perhaps unknowingly, encoded a prophetic vision of political upheaval, environmental collapse, and social fragmentation that would unfold 30 years later? The Lion King isn't just entertainment, it's a roadmap. Consider this. In the opening months of 2024, we witnessed unprecedented political instability across multiple continents. Nations that seemed stable for decades suddenly found their leadership structures crumbling from within. Opposition movements rose with shocking speed, backed by unlikely coalitions that promised radical change. The established order, represented by traditional values and institutional authority, faced systematic dismantling by forces that operated from the shadows. Sound familiar? Frame by frame, this mirrors Scar's methodical destruction of the Pride Land's established hierarchy. But the parallels go deeper than surface-level political drama. The specific tactics employed in 2024's upheavals follow Scar's playbook with disturbing precision. First came the scapegoating phase, identifying a figure of traditional authority and systematically destroying their reputation through manufactured crises. In the Pride Lands, Mufasa becomes the target. In 2024, we've seen respected institutions and leaders face similar coordinated attacks. The environmental dimension adds another layer of eerie correlation. The Pride Land's transformation from lush paradise to barren wasteland didn't happen overnight in the film. Careful analysis of the animation reveals a gradual process. Water sources drying up, vegetation withering, animal populations fleeing. The color palette shifts from warm golds and greens to harsh browns and grays. This isn't random artistic choice, it's a visual timeline. Compare this to 2024's climate events. Unprecedented drought patterns affecting agricultural regions worldwide, massive animal migrations disrupting ecosystems, and environmental refugees seeking resources in foreign territories. The watering hole conflicts depicted in Lion King 2 now play out in real time as communities compete for increasingly scarce resources. The social manipulation techniques prove most chilling in their accuracy. Scar doesn't seize power through brute force alone. He cultivates a coalition of the marginalized, the hyenas, who feel excluded from the Pride Land's prosperity. He offers them inclusion, resources, and revenge against those who kept them in the shadows. This recruitment strategy creates a powerful but ultimately destructive alliance. In 2024, political movements worldwide have employed identical tactics, identifying disenfranchised populations, promising them inclusion in a new order, and directing their frustration toward established institutions. The hyena's gleeful destruction of Pride Rock finds its echo in the enthusiastic dismantling of traditional structures by groups convinced they're fighting for justice. The animation itself contains visual prophecies that become apparent only in hindsight. During Scar's reign, the film shows bone-dry riverbeds where water once flowed freely. In several 2024 regions, identical scenes play out as climate change and mismanagement combine to create environmental disaster. The animators drew these sequences 3 decades ago, yet they perfectly capture satellite imagery from recent drought-stricken areas. Even more unsettling, the film's depiction of information control and narrative manipulation. Scar doesn't just seize physical power, he rewrites history. The Pride is told that Mufasa and Simba perished in the stampede, making Scar the rightful ruler. Truth becomes whatever serves the new regime's interests. This propaganda technique has dominated 2024's information landscape. Traditional narratives about history, economics, and social structures face systematic revision by groups that claim previous accounts were lies, designed to maintain unjust power structures. The very concept of objective truth becomes a battleground. The timing cannot be coincidence. Disney released The Lion King during a period of relative global stability. The Berlin Wall had fallen, the Cold War had ended, and Western liberal democracy seemed triumphant. Yet the animators created a story about institutional collapse, environmental catastrophe, and the rise of authoritarian coalitions built on resentment and false promises. Perhaps most disturbing, the film's timeline suggests we're still in the middle act. Scar's reign of terror doesn't last forever, but the damage inflicted during his rule leaves permanent scars on the Pride Land's social fabric. Recovery becomes possible only after complete collapse forces a reckoning with reality. The prophetic elements extend beyond mere thematic similarities. Specific visual motifs from the animation appear in 2024's real-world events with startling frequency. Scar's dramatic speeches from Pride Rock, silhouetted against stormy skies, find echoes in political rallies where leaders position themselves as saviors while darkness gathers around them. The Hyena's chaotic energy during their takeover of Pride Rock mirrors viral footage from 2024's civil unrest. The gleeful destruction, the sense of long-suppressed anger finally unleashed. The carnival atmosphere surrounding serious political upheaval, all present in both animated sequences and contemporary news coverage. This isn't pareidolia, seeing patterns where none exist. The correlations are too specific, too numerous, and too precisely timed to dismiss as coincidence. Either Disney's creative team possessed extraordinary insight into human nature and historical cycles, or they tapped into something deeper. The archetypal patterns that govern civilizational rise and fall. The question becomes, if The Lion King accurately predicted 2024's chaos, what does the rest of the story tell us about what comes next? Scar's rise to power wasn't a spontaneous grab for authority. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign that follows a precise methodology. When we examine his tactics frame by frame, we discover a masterclass in political manipulation that reads like a handbook for the upheavals we've witnessed throughout 2024. The first principle of Scar's approach: never appear as the aggressor. Throughout the early scenes, Scar positions himself as the victim of circumstance, the overlooked brother who deserves better treatment. This grievance narrative becomes the foundation for everything that follows. He doesn't demand power, he presents himself as the natural solution to problems he's carefully cultivated. This victimization strategy appears with startling consistency in 2024's political movements. Leaders emerge claiming they represent forgotten populations, marginalized voices, or oppressed groups fighting against entrenched elites. The rhetoric focuses not on what they want to build, but on what they've been denied. Scar's bitter monologues about being second in line echo in contemporary speeches about being left behind by global progress. The recruitment phase reveals Scar's true genius. He doesn't attempt to convert the lions, the established population who benefit from the current system. Instead, he ventures into the elephant graveyard to build alliances with the hyenas, a group explicitly excluded from Prideland society. These aren't random acts of inclusion. They're strategic partnerships with populations that have legitimate grievances against the status quo. Modern political coalitions follow this exact template. Rather than competing for moderate voters or established constituencies, successful 2024 movements have focused on mobilizing previously disengaged groups. They've identified populations that feel excluded from economic prosperity, cultural recognition, or political representation, then offered them a seat at the table in exchange for loyalty. The hyenas' enthusiasm for Scar's vision stems from genuine frustration with their circumstances. They've been relegated to the wasteland, forbidden from the abundant hunting grounds, and treated as inferior by Pride Rock's residents. Scar doesn't create their resentment. He simply provides focus and direction for anger that already existed. This dynamic explains why 2024's political upheavals often surprise established analysts. The energy comes from groups that traditional polling and media coverage largely ignored. Like the hyenas emerging from the elephant graveyard, these constituencies remained invisible until they suddenly appeared as decisive political forces. The "be prepared" sequence deserves particular analysis for its propaganda techniques. Scar doesn't simply announce his intentions. He creates a theatrical experience that transforms grievance into excitement. The song begins with individual complaints but builds into collective action. The hyenas start scattered and directionless, but end unified behind a common purpose. The visual choreography matters as much as the lyrics. Scar elevates himself physically above his followers while simultaneously presenting himself as their champion. He's both leader and fellow victim, authority figure and revolutionary. This paradox, claiming to overthrow the system while positioning oneself as its rightful ruler, appears throughout 2024's political messaging. The propaganda doesn't rely on complex policy arguments or detailed plans. Instead, it offers emotional satisfaction, the promise that current frustrations will be resolved through decisive action. Be prepared never explains what the hyenas will do once they achieve power, only that they'll no longer be excluded from it. Contemporary political movements employ identical techniques. Rally speeches focus on the emotional release of finally being heard rather than specific governance proposals. The message is transformation through disruption, with details deliberately left vague to allow followers to project their own hopes onto the movement. Scar's treatment of information proves especially prophetic. He doesn't simply lie about events, he creates alternative narratives that reframe reality to serve his purposes. When Mufasa perishes in the stampede, Scar immediately constructs a story that eliminates inconvenient witnesses, Simba, while positioning himself as the reluctant heir dealing with tragedy. This information manipulation strategy has dominated 2024's political landscape. Traditional narratives about historical events, economic systems, and social structures face systematic challenge from movements claiming previous accounts were fabricated to maintain unjust hierarchies. The goal isn't necessarily to establish new truths, but to undermine confidence in existing ones. The hyenas serve a crucial function in this information warfare. They become enthusiastic repeaters of Scar's narratives, spreading his version of events throughout their networks. Their genuine belief in the messages makes them effective messengers. They're not consciously lying, but rather sharing what they've been convinced is truth. Social media has created the perfect environment for this dynamic to flourish. Like the hyenas chattering in the elephant graveyard, online communities amplify alternative narratives through networks of true believers. The message spreads organically because the messengers genuinely believe they're sharing important information that mainstream sources won't report. Scar's coalition building reveals another key insight. Successful coups don't require majority support, only the right combination of motivated minorities. The hyenas represent a relatively small portion of the Pride Land's total population, but their unified commitment outweighs the passive majority's diffuse preferences. This principle explains how relatively small political movements achieved outsized influence in 2024. They didn't need to convince everyone, just enough people in strategic positions or crucial demographics. Intensity of support matters more than breadth when the established majority remains politically disengaged. The scapegoating mechanism deserves special attention. Scar doesn't just remove Mufasa from power, he ensures that Mufasa becomes the source of all problems. The drought, the social tensions, the economic difficulties, everything becomes evidence of failed leadership under the old regime. This retroactive blame assignment justifies the dramatic changes that follow. We've seen identical patterns throughout 2024's political upheavals. Previous leaders become responsible not just for their own decisions, but for systemic problems that predate their tenure. Historical injustices, economic inequalities, and social tensions all get attributed to specific individuals or institutions, creating clear targets for popular frustration. The effectiveness of this approach lies in its simplicity. Complex societal problems receive simple explanations. Everything wrong stems from corrupt leadership that prioritized the wrong people. The solution becomes equally straightforward. Remove the bad leaders and install better ones. But Scar's blueprint contains a fatal flaw that becomes apparent only after implementation. The coalition that enables the coup proves incapable of effective governance. The hyenas' enthusiasm for destruction doesn't translate into skills for construction. Their grievances were legitimate, but their proposed solutions create new problems worse than the original ones. This pattern has already begun emerging in 2024 contexts where disruptive movements achieved power. The energy that drove successful campaigns doesn't automatically generate effective administration. Tearing down existing structures proves much easier than building functional replacements. The question that haunts Scar's template: what happens when the revolution succeeds but the promised transformation fails to materialize? The most chilling aspect of the Lion King's prophetic power lies not in its political predictions, but in its environmental forecasting. The animators didn't just imagine Scar's political takeover, they visualized the ecological collapse that would inevitably follow, creating a frame-by-frame documentation of environmental disaster that mirrors 2024's climate crisis with disturbing precision. When Scar assumes control of Pride Rock, the transformation begins subtly. In the early scenes of his reign, careful viewers notice small details. Grass appears slightly yellower, water levels in streams sit marginally lower, and the abundant herds that once grazed peacefully start thinning out. This isn't dramatic Hollywood destruction. It's the gradual, almost imperceptible degradation that characterizes real ecological collapse. Compare this to satellite imagery from 2024's drought-affected regions. The progression follows an identical pattern. Initially, green agricultural areas slowly shift to brown, water reservoirs gradually shrink, and wildlife populations begin their exodus to more hospitable territories. The animators captured this process 3 decades before climate scientists would document it happening in real time across multiple continents. The color palette transformation deserves particular attention. During Mufasa's reign, the Pride Lands display rich golds, deep greens, and vibrant blues. Under Scar's rule, these hues systematically drain away, replaced by harsh browns, dusty grays, and sickly yellows. This isn't merely aesthetic choice. It represents the fundamental alteration of an ecosystem's health. Meteorologists analyzing 2024's extreme weather patterns have noted similar visual changes in affected regions. Formerly lush landscapes take on the exact color schemes depicted in Scar's Pride Lands. Satellite photography from drought-stricken areas shows the same brown-gray palette that Disney artists use to represent ecological collapse. The water crisis receives particularly prophetic treatment. The film shows once-flowing rivers reduced to cracked mud, forcing animals to compete for increasingly scarce resources. The famous watering hole scene from Lion King 2 depicts different species in territorial conflict over the few remaining water sources. A scenario that seemed fantastical in 1998, but has become documentary reality in 2024. Across multiple continents this year, communities have faced identical situations. Traditional water sources have dried up, forcing human and animal populations into direct competition for remaining supplies. The animated sequences showing desperate animals gathered around shrinking pools now serve as accurate representations of contemporary water conflicts. The migration patterns prove equally prescient. As the Pride Lands deteriorate, the film shows massive herds departing for distant territories, leaving behind empty grasslands and disrupted food chains. The remaining animals cluster around the few resources still available, creating unsustainable population pressures that accelerate environmental degradation. 2024's climate data reveals the same phenomenon occurring globally. Animal populations are shifting their ranges at unprecedented rates, following changing weather patterns and resource availability. Agricultural regions face similar pressures as changing conditions force both human and animal populations to relocate, creating the exact resource competition scenarios depicted in the animated sequences. The fire symbolism throughout Scar's reign takes on new significance when viewed through 2024's lens. The film uses flames not just as dramatic effect, but as representation of uncontrolled destruction consuming natural systems. Scar's association with fire imagery suggests that his political choices actively contribute to environmental catastrophe. This correlation has materialized with startling accuracy in regions where political instability has combined with environmental stress. Areas experiencing governmental upheaval in 2024 have simultaneously faced increased wildfire activity, suggesting that social chaos and ecological collapse reinforce each other in destructive feedback loops. The hunting ground depletion provides another layer of environmental prophecy. Under Mufasa's leadership, the Pride Lands supported abundant wildlife through sustainable practices. Scar's regime eliminates these constraints, allowing unrestricted exploitation of natural resources. The short-term abundance satisfies immediate demands but quickly exhausts the ecosystem's capacity for renewal. Contemporary environmental data shows this exact pattern playing out in multiple contexts. Political movements that prioritize immediate resource extraction over long-term sustainability have achieved short-term economic gains while setting up long-term ecological disasters. The animated depiction of overhunted grasslands now serves as a template for understanding real-world resource depletion. The circle of life concept, central to the film's environmental message, represents the delicate balance that maintains ecosystem health. Scar's fundamental error lies in viewing natural resources as commodities to be consumed rather than systems to be maintained. This philosophical shift from stewardship to exploitation drives the environmental collapse that follows his political victory. This ideological transformation has characterized many of 2024's environmental policy shifts. Traditional conservation approaches, based on long-term sustainability and ecosystem balance, have been replaced by short-term extraction strategies that prioritize immediate economic benefits over ecological health. The volcanic imagery during climactic scenes adds another prophetic dimension. The film associates Scar's final confrontation with geological instability, suggesting that political and environmental disasters culminate in fundamental systemic breakdown. The visual metaphor implies that societies ignoring environmental limits eventually face catastrophic consequences. 2024's increased seismic activity in politically unstable regions creates an eerie parallel to these animated sequences. Areas experiencing both social upheaval and environmental stress have shown increased geological instability, as if the Earth itself responds to the breakdown of sustainable systems. The returning herds at the film's conclusion provide hope but also warning. Environmental recovery becomes possible only after complete systematic collapse forces a return to sustainable practices. The Pride Land's restoration requires not just political change, but fundamental transformation in how the community relates to its environment. This suggests that 2024's environmental crisis may need to reach full catastrophic proportions before effective solutions become politically feasible. The film's timeline implies that ecological recovery requires social trauma severe enough to overcome entrenched interests resistant to necessary changes. The dust storm sequences that mark Scar's reign offer perhaps the most literal environmental prophecy. The animators depicted massive dust clouds engulfing the Pride Lands, transforming fertile grasslands into barren wasteland. These scenes seemed like fantastical exaggeration when created, but 2024's satellite imagery shows identical dust storm patterns affecting agricultural regions worldwide. The interconnection between political dysfunction and environmental collapse provides the film's most important insight. Scar's political failures don't just happen alongside ecological disaster, they directly cause it. Poor governance creates conditions that make environmental catastrophe inevitable. This relationship has proven prophetic for 2024's global situation. Regions experiencing political instability have simultaneously faced environmental crises, while areas maintaining effective governance have better managed climate challenges. The film suggests this isn't coincidence, but rather evidence of fundamental connections between social and ecological health. The question that emerges from this environmental prophecy: if the animated timeline accurately predicted both political upheaval and ecological collapse, what does the restoration sequence tell us about the requirements for recovery? The most psychologically disturbing aspect of The Lion King's prophetic accuracy lies in how it predicted the complete breakdown of social cohesion that has defined 2024. The film doesn't just forecast political and environmental collapse, it maps the precise psychological mechanisms through which communities tear themselves apart, relationship by relationship, until the very concept of shared reality disintegrates. Timon and Pumbaa represent perhaps the most accurate prediction of 2024's dominant cultural response to crisis. Systematic escapism disguised as wisdom. Their Hakuna Matata philosophy isn't presented as cowardice but as enlightenment, a superior approach to life's difficulties that rejects traditional responsibilities in favor of immediate gratification and willful ignorance. This mindset has become the defining characteristic of 2024's cultural landscape. Faced with overwhelming political chaos, environmental crisis, and social instability, large populations have adopted the Timon and Pumbaa model: retreat from engagement with serious issues, embrace hedonistic distraction, and treat anyone who insists on addressing problems as unnecessarily anxious or mentally unhealthy. The psychological appeal of this approach becomes clear when we examine Simba's character arc during his exile period. Traumatized by witnessing his father's demise and convinced of his own guilt, Simba finds the no-worries philosophy irresistibly attractive. It offers liberation from responsibility, grief, and the complex demands of leadership. The jungle becomes a refuge where nothing matters except immediate pleasure. Contemporary social media culture has created the perfect environment for mass adoption of this escapist mindset. Platforms designed for entertainment have become primary news sources, while serious journalism gets dismissed as too negative or anxiety-inducing. The Hakuna Matata approach to information consumption, avoiding anything that might disturb one's peace of mind, has become mainstream behavioral pattern. The generational divide predicted in the film has materialized with startling precision. Mufasa represents traditional values: duty, responsibility, long-term thinking, and respect for established wisdom. His approach emphasizes gradual progress within existing systems and careful stewardship of inherited institutions. Scar embodies revolutionary thinking, immediate transformation, rejection of traditional authority, and willingness to destroy existing structures to create something new. This exact ideological split has defined 2024's political landscape across multiple societies. Older generations cling to institutional approaches that worked in previous eras, while younger cohorts demand immediate systematic change. Neither side can comprehend the other's perspective, leading to the complete breakdown of intergenerational dialogue that the film depicts during Scar's reign. Simba's exile represents the psychological journey of an entire generation, raised on traditional values but traumatized by witnessing those values' apparent failure. When Mufasa's approach leads to catastrophe, regardless of whether Simba actually caused it, the young prince loses faith in everything his father represented. This trauma-induced rejection of traditional wisdom creates the psychological space for alternative philosophies to take root. 2024's young adult population has followed this exact trajectory. Raised with expectations that education, hard work, and institutional participation would lead to prosperity and security, they've instead witnessed economic instability, environmental degradation, and political dysfunction. Like Simba fleeing into the jungle, many have abandoned traditional paths in favor of alternative approaches that promise easier solutions. Rafiki's role as wisdom keeper becomes particularly relevant when examining 2024's information crisis. In the film, Rafiki possesses genuine insight into past events and future possibilities, but his knowledge gets transmitted through cryptic methods that require interpretation. He doesn't provide simple answers, but rather guides others toward discovering truth for themselves. This model of wisdom transmission has become nearly extinct in contemporary culture. Traditional knowledge keepers, teachers, journalists, researchers, religious leaders find their authority systematically undermined by information systems that promise immediate access to all knowledge without requiring the patient work of genuine learning. The Rafiki model, which demands humility and effort from those seeking wisdom, cannot compete with platforms offering instant answers to complex questions. The lioness's eventual uprising against Scar provides a template for understanding 2024's resistance movements. These characters don't rebel immediately when conditions deteriorate. They endure progressive degradation while hoping things will improve. Only when the situation becomes completely unbearable do they organize collective action against the failed leadership. This pattern has repeated across multiple contexts in 2024. Populations tolerate declining conditions for extended periods, attributing problems to temporary circumstances or external factors rather than systemic leadership failures. Resistance emerges only when deterioration reaches levels that threaten basic survival, by which point the damage may be irreversible. Zazu represents institutional bureaucracy's complete inability to adapt to crisis conditions. His rigid adherence to protocol and formal procedures becomes actively counterproductive when circumstances demand flexibility and innovation. Rather than evolving to meet new challenges, he continues performing traditional functions that no longer serve their intended purposes. This institutional paralysis has characterized government and corporate responses to 2024's crises. Established organizations continue operating according to procedures designed for stable conditions, even when those procedures prove inadequate for managing unprecedented challenges. Like Zazu insisting on morning reports while the Pride lands burn, institutional leaders maintain normal operations while fundamental systems collapse around them. The psychological manipulation that enables Scar's rise proves especially prophetic. He doesn't simply lie to his followers, he provides them with emotional satisfaction that makes truth irrelevant. The hyenas don't support Scar because his promises are realistic, but because believing in those promises feels better than accepting their actual circumstances. This dynamic has dominated 2024's information landscape. Political movements succeed not by providing accurate analysis of complex problems, but by offering narratives that make followers feel validated, empowered, and morally superior. The psychological rewards of believing become more important than the factual accuracy of the beliefs themselves. The breakdown of communication between different social groups mirrors the film's depiction of species segregation under Scar's rule. Lions, hyenas, and other animals stop interacting as members of a shared community and instead retreat into separate enclaves defined by mutual suspicion and competing narratives about reality. Social media algorithms have accelerated this fragmentation by creating information bubbles that reinforce existing beliefs while filtering out contradictory perspectives. Like the Pride lands dividing into hostile territories, contemporary societies have split into communities that literally inhabit different versions of reality. The trauma bonding that develops between Scar's followers provides insight into how crisis conditions create psychological dependencies on authoritarian leadership. The hyenas become more loyal to Scar as conditions worsen, not despite the deterioration, but because of it. Shared suffering creates group identity that makes questioning leadership feel like betrayal of the community. This mechanism has appeared repeatedly in 2024's political movements. Groups facing genuine hardships develop intense loyalty to leaders who acknowledge their pain, even when those leaders' policies exacerbate the problems they claim to solve. The psychological comfort of feeling understood outweighs rational evaluation of proposed solutions. The question that emerges from this psychological prophecy: if the film accurately predicted how social bonds would dissolve under pressure, what does Simba's return tell us about the requirements for rebuilding functional communities? Simba's return to the Pride Lands offers the most crucial prophecy in The Lion King, a blueprint for how societies recover from systematic collapse. But the restoration process depicted in the film contains warnings as much as hope. If 2024 represents our Scar period, then understanding the mechanics of recovery becomes essential for navigating what comes next. The catalyst for Simba's return isn't internal motivation, but external crisis. Nala's arrival in the jungle forces him to confront the reality he's been avoiding through years of Hakuna Matata escapism. She brings news that the Pride Lands face complete ecological collapse, that is, people are starving, and that his continued absence enables the ongoing catastrophe. This intervention model suggests that 2024's escapist populations won't self-motivate toward engagement with serious problems. Like Simba, they'll require direct confrontation with consequences that can no longer be ignored or rationalized away. The comfortable illusions that sustain withdrawal from responsibility will need to become literally unsustainable before change becomes psychologically possible. Rafiki's role in Simba's transformation provides the template for how wisdom traditions can guide recovery. The old mandrill doesn't lecture or argue. He uses symbolic actions and pointed questions to help Simba rediscover truths he already knows but has suppressed. The famous "you are more than what you have become" moment represents the reactivation of dormant potential rather than the acquisition of new capabilities. This suggests that 2024's recovery will require not revolutionary innovation, but the rediscovery of proven principles that have been abandoned or forgotten. The tools for rebuilding functional societies already exist within traditional knowledge systems. They simply need to be remembered and reapplied by populations that have been distracted by newer, less effective approaches. The confrontation between Simba and Scar reveals the inevitable dynamics of restoration movements facing entrenched dysfunction. Scar doesn't voluntarily relinquish power when presented with evidence of his failures. Instead, he doubles down on manipulation, attempting to shift blame for the Pride Lands condition onto everyone except himself and his policies. This pattern has already begun emerging in 2024 contexts where failed leadership faces accountability pressure. Rather than acknowledging policy mistakes or accepting responsibility for negative outcomes, embattled authorities typically escalate their rhetoric, identify new scapegoats, and promise that their approaches would succeed if not for sabotage by hidden enemies. The fire sequence during the final battle provides symbolic insight into how restoration conflicts play out. The Pride Lands literally burn as old and new approaches clash for supremacy. This destruction isn't accidental collateral damage. It's the inevitable result of trying to maintain dysfunctional systems while simultaneously building functional alternatives. Societies attempting to transition from Scar periods to Simba periods should expect similar conflagrations. The change process itself will likely be more destructive than either the preceding dysfunction or the eventual stability. Recovery requires burning away accumulated institutional rot, which creates temporary chaos even when the ultimate direction is positive. The hyenas' abandonment of Scar at the crucial moment illustrates how authoritarian coalitions ultimately self-destruct. Their loyalty was transactional, based on promised benefits rather than genuine shared values. When Scar attempts to blame them for the Pride Lands problems, they immediately turn against him with the same enthusiasm they once showed for his cause. This dynamic suggests that 2024's populist movements contain the seeds of their own dissolution. The coalitions binding diverse grievance groups together are inherently unstable because they're united by shared opposition rather than common vision. Once the original targets are removed or circumstances change, these alliances typically fragment as constituent groups discover their interests actually conflict. The restoration of the Pride Lands happens remarkably quickly once proper leadership returns. Rain falls almost immediately after Simba's victory, suggesting that many apparent environmental problems were actually governance problems in disguise. The ecosystem's capacity for recovery remained intact. It simply needed the removal of policies and practices that prevented natural restoration processes. This offers hope for addressing 2024's seemingly intractable challenges. Many problems that appear to require complex technological solutions or massive resource investments might actually need primarily institutional changes that allow existing systems to function properly. The key insight is distinguishing between genuine limitations and artificial constraints created by dysfunctional governance. However, the film's timeline suggests that recovery, while possible, isn't automatic or immediate. Simba's return initiates restoration but doesn't complete it. Lion King 2 reveals that the next generation faces entirely new challenges related to integrating populations that were divided during the crisis period. Scar's followers don't simply disappear, they become the outsiders who require careful reintegration into functional society. This implies that 2024's eventual recovery will create new categories of social problems. Populations that supported dysfunctional leadership during the crisis period won't automatically embrace restored institutions. Instead, they may become permanent opposition movements that require ongoing management through subsequent generations. The Kiara Kovu storyline provides the template for how post-crisis societies can heal these divisions. Integration happens not through conquest or conversion, but through the next generation forming relationships that transcend the previous era's conflicts. The young inherit the consequences of their parents' battles but aren't bound by the same psychological investments in old grievances. This suggests that full recovery from 2024's upheavals may require an entire generational cycle. The populations currently engaged in cultural and political warfare may never fully reconcile, but their children can potentially build bridges across divisions that seem permanent to current participants. The cyclical nature of the Lion King narrative offers the most important long-term insight. The story doesn't end with permanent victory over evil. It establishes patterns that will likely repeat. Scar represents archetypal forces that emerge periodically when societies become complacent about maintaining the conditions that enable prosperity and stability. Historical analysis supports this cyclical interpretation. The political, environmental, and social dynamics depicted in The Lion King have appeared repeatedly across different cultures and time periods. The specific technologies and cultural details change, but the underlying patterns remain remarkably consistent. This means that successfully navigating 2024's crisis won't eliminate the possibility of future scar periods. Instead, it should prepare societies to recognize warning signs and respond more effectively when similar challenges inevitably emerge. The goal isn't permanent solution, but improved pattern recognition and response capabilities. The film's ultimate message seems to be that conscious engagement with these cycles offers the only protection against their destructive potential. Simba's tragedy stemmed from naivety about power dynamics and human nature. His eventual wisdom comes from understanding that maintaining functional society requires constant vigilance against the forces that naturally tend toward corruption and decay. For 2024's audience, this suggests that recovery will require not just fixing immediate problems, but developing institutional mechanisms that can detect and respond to similar threats in the future. The children watching The Lion King today will face their own scar periods in 30 years, and their ability to handle those challenges will depend on how well current societies learn from both the film's warnings and 2024's real-world validation of its prophetic accuracy. The circle of life ultimately represents the recognition that these patterns are natural, inevitable, and manageable, but only through conscious participation in the cycles rather than denial of their existence. The choice isn't between order and chaos, but between conscious navigation of predictable patterns and unconscious repetition of preventable mistakes. Perhaps Disney's animators didn't predict the future so much as they remembered the past. The Lion King works as prophecy because it captures timeless patterns that societies have been repeating throughout human history. The question now becomes, will we learn from this iteration enough to handle the next one more gracefully?